Okay, so welcome to the Request for Reimbursement Training, Workbook Training this afternoon. This training is being put on by the Division of Child and Family Services. My name is Carla Delgado, and I'm the Management Analyst 4 in our Victim Services GMU unit. Today is August 10th, 2023, and we are part of the Department of Health and Human Services. So our agenda this afternoon, we'd like you to get to know our unit. We have a lot of new staff that are in the unit now. A quick overview of the victim services grants and programs that we oversee. And then we'll go into the agency risk assessments and the request for request for reimbursement workbook. Some of the different areas in navigating the workbook and what we ask agencies to submit. Information about revised RFRs, and then deadlines and other important tips that could be helpful to you and your agencies. So an overview of our staff and structure. Andrea Valenzuela is our social services manager here, and she oversees our unit. And then, like I mentioned, my name is Carla Delgado. I'm the management analyst 4. We have a new social services program specialist that will be starting later this month, and we will introduce her all to you at the next quarterly call and throughout our email communications and other meetings that we have with you before then. Christine Holbrook is a Grants and Projects Analyst 2 here. Tracy Brose is a Grants and Projects Analyst 2. And we have Sharon Usher. She's our new Management Analyst 2. We do have a vacant CAP program officer position. Dina Piffin is covering for the CAP program officer at this time, but she's also our crime victims liaison. And Alma Bustamante is the manager of the Victims of Crime program, and she has other staff that work within her program area. The grants and programs that Victim Services oversees includes the Victims of Crime Act, or VOCA, Victims of Domestic Violence, which we call Marriage License, Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, the American Recovery Plan for FIPSA, specifically for domestic violence. And then we also have the American Recovery Plan, Family Violence Prevention Services for sexual victimization, COVID testing, our anti-terrorism and emergency assistance program, and then our programs, which include the Victims of Crime Act compensation program and the confidential address program. So at this time, we'd like for all of you to put into the chat your name, your agency, what part of the state you work in, how long you've worked in victim services, and whether you are the primary person responsible for completing RFRs in your agency. This will also help us with attendance for today's training, and we'll use that to list which agencies participated today. So now I want to talk about the GERS. So the grant instruction and requirements, or GERS as we refer to them, those are updated annually and sent with the executed notice of subaward, or your NOSAs. These requirements are updated each state fiscal year and are sent to you with your executed NOSA. They must be read, and the last page must be signed and returned to our agency. For most of you, you should have already submitted them. If you have not for VOCA and marriage license, please send them in as soon as possible. So now we'll go into risk assessments. The Office of Victims of Crime guidelines state that all state administering agencies must evaluate each subrecipient's risk of noncompliance for purposes of determining the appropriate subrecipient monitoring. In Victim Services GMU, the risk level designations are low, moderate, and high. It has absolutely nothing to do with our perception of the ability of your organization to perform its goals, but it is something that helps us with identifying the activities that will assist us in monitoring your agency and it ensures that the subaward is used for authorized purposes in compliance with federal statutes, regulations, and the terms and conditions of the subaward, and that subaward performance goals are achieved. You will be notified, or your agency will be notified of its risk level in that executed notice of subaward. Backup documentation is very important. And so regardless of the risk level, all agencies must maintain all backup documentation within the agency. By signing that last page of the grant instructions and requirements and the monthly request for reimbursements, you are certifying that your agency has possession of and maintains all required backup documentation, which provides support for the expenses claimed. It is your agency's responsibility to retain all backup documentation, and the documentation is subject to inspection during monitoring or audit at any given time. Failure to provide backup documentation during inspection or audits may result in the requirement to pay back the funds. And you'll see throughout the presentation that, you know, it's really, we're hoping that the agencies really understand that it is your responsibility to maintain that backup documentation for the required retention schedule that is associated with the funding. So now we'll talk about the risk levels and the submission requirements for each risk level. So first we have low risk, and they require that, or low risk agencies require that that you submit personnel backup documentation, a general ledger, and our GPAs and or management analysts will request backup documentation at least once a year during the fiscal year. GPA reviews are something that can change your risk level. For example, if our staff finds that the backup documentation for other categories is not accurate with what the agency submitted on the request for reimbursement, this may change the risk level. Then we have our moderate risk agencies. Moderate risk is very similar to low risk, but 100% backup documentation will be requested at least twice during the fiscal year. And lastly, our high risk. The high risks will require 100% backup documentation with your RFRs. And we may also schedule monthly or quarterly technical assistance meetings with the agencies to help support them in being able to submit the information correctly, or any other TA assistance that the agency may need. For any newly funded programs, they will be considered, or they would have to follow the high risk requirements for the first 6 months of the grant period. The organization will then, or our staff will then review and determine whether or not they have met all of the requirements and are following everything that we need from them, and then decide whether or not they will be, the risk level will be assigned at that point at the 6 months. And then you will know if you would still have to continue to submit all backup documentation or go to a different risk level. So some of the things that an agency can control about their risk level is, that the agency cannot control about their risk level is the last time that DCFS completed an on-site review or a monitoring, the total amount of funding that you receive from GMU, and past monitoring findings. We have received some questions in regards to whether or not an agency can lower their risk level. And the answer is yes. There are things that you can do, and right now you're doing one. So attending all required. Can everyone please mute themselves? Reducing the number of budget modifications expending all of the funds that you are awarded, submitting reports and RFRs on or before the 15th of the month in the month that they are due, provide all requests for documentations on or before the due date of the request, have qualified, well-trained staff, list your diverse funding sources on your budget summary, meet your program objectives in your scope of work, and while we understand the nature of the population we serve, having scope numbers that state that you're going to help 1,000 people when you're only able to help 100 shows us that you may not have an accurate understanding of the population in need in your areas. So if you're going to help 500 people and you end up 450, that's a better understandable expectation to put on your scopes of work. So that was a lot of information. Does anyone have any questions? Or Christine, are there any questions in the chat?
No, I haven't seen any questions other than some people couldn't hear, but I think we got that fixed.
Okay, perfect. Does anyone have any questions at this time?
I do. If there is turnover, do you have to fill out a form to request to have that person changed or do any kind of documentation to have them like edited from the original budget?
Yes. So we are going to go into the RFRs right now, and Tracy will actually go over that and will explain that form as well.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Any other questions before we move into RFRs?
We have one question from from Belinda. She's asking where to find their risk. If you're
Their risk
executed
level?
NOSA, yeah, the risk level. And it's on the email that we send out. In there, it'll tell you what your risk level is.
And it cut out a little bit for me, so it'll be in the email that Christine sends out, and it's on the executed NOSA for those that didn't get the sound. Okay, so now I'll turn over the training to Tracy, who's going to go over the next part of the presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. And to answer the question about the risk level, just in a little more detail, the risk level will be on the email that had the NOSA that was sent out. It will also now be on your workbook, and I will point that out later in this presentation. Okay, what is an RFR? The RFR stands for Request for Reimbursement. They are submitted monthly by agencies to be reimbursed for grant allowable expenditures. RFRs consist of a signed cover sheet and the corresponding backup documentation. And agencies are also required to submit their Excel workbook with each request. And just a basic overview, all RFR requests are paid on a reimbursement basis only. Proof of payment must exist prior to reimbursement from the Victim Services Grants Management Unit. All items being reimbursed must exist within the award period, and they are due no later than the 15th of the month following the expenditure. Just a little note here, because we are so late in getting the workbooks out to everyone, July RFRs will not be due until the end of this month, so August 31st. That has been extended due to the delay. Budgets. In terms of how they relate to the RFRs, it's important to remember to check that any item or expense is on your budget prior to submitting it for reimbursement. Now we're going to kind of start and look at the overview of the RFR workbook. We're going to be looking at the different RFR categories and the requirements for each. We'll do a walkthrough of the actual new workbook after reviewing the following slides. Personnel. Personnel backup requires pay stubs, activity-based timesheets, or 100% attestations if the position is completely paid by for the same grant. Fringe backup requires invoices showing employee breakdowns. Just a note that employer paid portions can only be reimbursed. Proof of payment of invoices is required. And basically, when you're submitting your documentation and you're entering items into the workbooks, just think, would someone who knows nothing about our agency be able to understand the documentation or the entries, and make notes if needed to make things a little clearer. All personnel, including the fringe documentation, is the same regardless of risk level. And again, agencies must submit pay stubs, activity-based timesheets, or attestations, along with invoices and proof of payments for fringe documentation. Going into a little more detail, what is an activity-based timesheet? This is a special timesheet that breaks down employee time by funding source. It must reflect the total activities for which the employee was compensated by the agency and cover both federally funded and all other activities. It should also be signed by the employee and the employee's supervisor. In terms of how you would use the activity-based timesheet to apply the allocated percentage to personnel expenses, it's a very simple calculation. I know it, for those who've been with us previously, with the old workbook, it got a little bit complicated, but we're back to a very simple grant percentage allocation, which is basically just total hours worked on the grant divided by total work hours. It's important to remember that the hours in the calculation are actual worked hours and should not include any PTO or other non-worked times. So a simple example is right here. An employee clocked 80 hours during a pay period. Of those 80 hours, 72 of them were worked, 8 were PTO. Of those 72 worked hours, 18 were worked towards the award. The formula then is 18 divided by 72, which equals 25%. And then that 25% grant percentage would then be applied to the payroll and fringe for that employee for that pay period to determine the total allocated personnel amount for the award.
And Tracy, we do have a question.
Perfect, yes.
Do you only need the activity-based timesheets for VOCA hours? So if it's a VOCA award, do they only need to show that?
No, we would prefer to see all funding sources that the employee is being worked on. I know this has been a question, so we do prefer to see the span of worked hours. More to show that the grant percentage allocation is being done correctly.
And then Karen also has a question about PTO. She wants to know what pays for that.
Okay, no, that's a great question. So in order to, what you would do is you would just apply the same percentage to the PTO pay rate. So that if they were being paid for their PTO, the percentage of that PTO would be the same. It'd be to 25%. Does that make sense?
Not really.
Okay. Yes, it is this. It is the same as last year. It's just a little bit simpler calculation. So basically, we're showing the percentage worked on the grant. And to do that, we're taking out the, we're just looking at hours worked. So to get a percentage amount, and then that percentage can be applied to every aspect of the personnel. It can be applied to the gross wages, which should include the PTO amount if you choose to. It can be applied to fringe, workers' comp, taxes. Basically, this calculation is just to determine what is the percentage that we're going to apply to all items within the personnel category. Does that make sense? A little bit more sense?
Yeah, she said she understands now.
Okay.
There's been a few other questions I've just answered in the chat.
Okay, perfect. I know it's kind of complicated, and we are also here. We can do more one-on-one work. The GPAs are happy to do more one-on-one work with you if you need to. So please make sure to reach out to us after the presentation if you have more extensive questions, and we'll be happy to help in any way we can. Now, this is to kind of go back to that question earlier. This is our new personnel change request form. This is what agencies can use when they need to update personnel. And we'll also have one for other categories. These will not be taking the place of subaward amendments. Amendments will still be needed when changing scope of works, creating new budget categories, or moving funds. These are basically intended to allow and approve changes to already established categories that don't affect the scope of work or budget. And we'll be sending out these forms with the new workbooks. These forms come in an Excel workbook, and they have an instruction page, like the screenshot above in yellow, and then a tab for the type of change the agency is requesting. That's in white. For personnel changes, this form should be used if needing to add, remove, or change an employee on your grant award. Each personnel change request form should contain the names and titles for all employees that are to be included in current or future reimbursements. This is really important because each change request for personnel will supersede the last. We will not look at prior NOSAs, subaward amendments, or previously approved change requests searching for approved personnel. This form needs to be submitted to and approved by the Victim Services GMU prior to the monthly RFR submission in which the change takes effect. So whenever you want to change your personnel, make sure that all personnel are listed with each change request form. Because like I said, each form is going to supersede the last, and that's for personnel only. Okay. Beginning this fiscal year, an expense allocation worksheet will need to be included as part of the RFR backup for each expense. This change will affect all categories other than personnel. The worksheet should document what the expense is and how it is being allocated across funding sources. The amount of the expense allocated to the grant will be the amount entered into the summary tab of the new RFR workbook. The workbook entry should coincide with the worksheet amount. This is a sample of an allocation worksheet. For those agencies that already have something like this in place, You may continue using your own allocation worksheets. For those agencies where this is a new process, we can send you this worksheet or you can create your own. Please contact your assigned GPA for assistance in implementing this new process. Before we move on to travel training, are there any questions about the new personnel change request form or the cost allocation worksheets?
Yes.
Tracy Karen from Catholic Charities, she said she has one that she'd like to share. Wants an example of an activity-based timesheet that does the calculations for her.
Perfect. Thank you, Karen.
There's a couple of questions about the cost allocation worksheet. Need a cost allocation worksheet if they are not splitting the cost between funding sources.
You mean if you're applying 100% of the cost to a particular grant? Then no. If you can just make I would just ask if you can please make a note on the back of documentation showing 100% to whichever award you're using. Just so that it is clear from the backup. I think Christine is going to be answering some of the questions in chat. I think we'll go ahead and move on for the time being to travel training. For travel training, all travel training must be pre-approved and on your budget narrative. It obviously must be related to the purpose of the grant, and we can only reimburse after the trip or training has been completed. In terms of meals, please make sure that you differentiate between the meal purchase for an employee or that of a client if they are traveling together. Meals for employees should be in travel training, and meals for victims should be expensed in other. Meals for employees are also only reimbursable when the employee is in a travel status and when the final destination is more than 50 miles one way from the employee's workstation. Meals and refreshments served during meetings to employees, boards of directors, professional associations, etc., are not eligible for reimbursement. Reimbursement for incidentals will occur only when the travel consists of a flight or overnight stay. I apologize for the pause. I have a tickle in my throat. Meals will be reimbursed at the GSA rate for the employee's destination. We prefer that a printout of the GSA rate for the area visited be attached with the RFR backup documentation. Actual cost versus GSA rate depends on the agency's written travel policies. If reimbursing actual cost, an agency must include meal receipts. Just a note, you cannot submit both reimbursement methods. Please choose one, and tips on meals cannot be reimbursed. Employee meals be reimbursed. When the travel is to a destination that is at least 50 miles one way from their workstation. For breakfast per diem, they must depart at or before 7 a.m. For lunch, depart at or before 11 a.m. and return to the work site after 1:30. And for dinner, depart at or before 5:30 p.m. and return to the work site after 7 p.m. Meals provided as part of meeting or conferences are not eligible for reimbursement. This is the website for the GSA information. These change every fiscal year, typically on October 1st, and agencies are responsible to check the website for the most current rate when requesting reimbursement for travel. Just an FYI, mileage rates typically change around January 1st. In terms of documentation needed for travel, they include a printout of the GSA rate for the location being visited, receipts for parking, airfare, conference registration fees, receipts for car rentals and other ground transportation. Grants do not reimburse for tips or donations. A hotel front desk itemized receipt, proof of payment, credit card statement or bank statement, mileage log and proof of payment to the employee for mileage reimbursement. An employee's normal daily commute is not reimbursable. That's travel to and from the employee's residence to work. And a travel claim is required for any travel that is more than simply local mileage. And then if you attend a conference, the conference agenda as well. All expenses must be submitted on the same RFR in order to avoid duplication of payment on different elements of the same trip. Travel can only be expensed after all elements of the travel have been completed, regardless of payment date. And then here are the GERS guidelines for all the travel requirements. Rating, backup documentation for each section must include an invoice, cost allocation, and proof of payment. If payment is made with a credit card, the credit card statement listing the listing the purchase must be submitted as well as the proof of payment to the credit card company for the statement amount. A couple of tips. Make sure that your proof of payment is not covering part of the invoice when you scan backup documentation for your RFR submissions. And if the cost is not on your approved budget, make sure that you contact your GPA for approval. This is where the category change request form will come in, and we will discuss that in just a couple of slides. Equipment. Any equipment purchases must be pre-approved. This includes electronics of all types. An equipment log must be maintained, which includes the list of equipment, the date purchased, the funding source, the cost, serial numbers, physical location of the equipment, use and condition, last date inventoried, and ultimate disposition. We have an equipment log that we've created. If you need any, if you'd like to use ours, just please reach out and we'll be happy to send that to you. Otherwise, feel free to keep your own as long as it has this information included on it. Any equipment purchases, again, must be pre-approved. And then here is the GERS detailing the equipment information. Just another note, all computers must be labeled with property of, and then the grant name and number. For contracts and consultants, prior to your initial reimbursement, this cost must be on your budget narrative and approved by the Victim Services Grants Management Unit. The contract, applicable licenses, and HIPAA confidentiality forms must be submitted to Victim Services GMU prior to your first RFR submission. In terms of what kind of documentation is needed for an RFR for this category, invoices from the contractor or consultant, cost allocation, and proof of payments. No contractor expense will be reimbursed until we have a copy of the executed and current contract for each contractor consultant. Here is this is the change category request form. This form should be used if needing to add or change line item expense for any category other than personnel. Unlike personnel, this form will not supersede previous requests. However, like personnel, it needs to be submitted via email and approved by the GMU prior to the monthly RFR submission in which the change takes effect. This category change request form is actually on the same workbook as the personnel. So they will both be sent out together with the new workbooks. For match, the documentation for match is the same for the previous categories, just as if you were requesting reimbursement. Volunteer match documentation would include volunteer sign-in sheets and a volunteer worth printout. This is would basically be information based on if the volunteer were an actual employee, what would their wage be. And there are actual websites that you can go to look up volunteer rates throughout the country. Match should be identified on your general ledger, and this is the GERS for more information on cost sharing or matching requirements. Match is required for VOCA and FIPSA awards. VOCA subrecipients who think they will have difficulty meeting the match requirement may apply for a match waiver. The match waiver was included in your NOSA this fiscal year. There is no match waiver available for FIPSA. Match can be volunteers, in-kind support, or any services not paid for by federal funding. And for more information, you can contact us or review GERS 2411. In terms of submitting the RFR, make sure that all items are on your approved budget and that you've submitted a change request form if needed prior to submitting the RFR. Double check that what you entered in the workbook matches your documentation. Write notes on any documentation that you think might need further explanation. Print and sign the RFR tab for the month you are submitting. Put the documentation you are required to submit based on your risk level in the order that they are listed in your workbook summary tab, and then scan them. Email the RFR workbook, the signed RFR cover sheet, and backup documentation to fundsrequest@dcfs.nv.gov. RFR is approved by the Victim Services GMU. An email reply to the email in which the RFR was submitted will be sent, stating that the RFR has been received, processed, and approved by the Victim Services Grants Management Unit and submitted to Fiscal for payment. We will not include any additional details. If an RFR cannot be processed as originally submitted, it will be returned to the agency. If the Victim Services GMU identifies that the submitted RFR is incomplete or incorrect, the RFR will be returned back to the subrecipient for corrections. The Victim Services GMU will not complete corrections on behalf of the subrecipient and will not process the RFR for payment until a corrected RFR is submitted. This is something new for this year, but we have been advised that that we will no longer be making any kind of adjustments to RFRs on an agency's behalf. The GMU will provide the subrecipient with information on what was identified as incomplete or incorrect and why the RFR was returned for corrections. These will still be considered original RFRs. Revised RFRs. Not to be confused with RFRs that were returned and are being resubmitted. Those are still considered original. Revised RFRs are those that are submitted with adjustments after the original RFR has been processed. Revised RFRs can be used to add additional costs or remove costs or change costs to an RFR. Make sure that when submitting a revised RFR that the revised box on the RFR tab is checked. We'll go over that again a little bit. Print and sign the new revised RFR cover sheet and email it to fundsrequest@dcfs.nv.gov with an email explaining the changes, the attached signed RFR cover sheet, and any additional documentation for the new items that were adjusted. Please do not resubmit all previous documentation, just the documentation to show what the changes were. And then the Excel workbook for the award. The award period. Services prior to the first day of the award cannot be charged, and some expenses may need to be prorated. The grant cannot reimburse for services after the last day of the award period. This may also require proration. In terms of the RFR processing, if an employee item or item is not on the workbook and or budget narrative, it will not be reimbursed. Remember to submit the appropriate change form for workbook updates prior to RFR submission, and all documentation must be maintained by the agency for all RFR requests. Just a couple of final notes and review. RFRs are submitted on a reimbursement basis only. They are due no later than the 15th of the month following expenditure, except for July, as I said earlier, which will be due August 31st. All documentation must be maintained by the agency. If an employee or item is not on a workbook or budget narrative, it will not be reimbursed. Don't forget to submit a change request form for any workbook updates prior to sending the RFR. Our goal is to process all RFRs within 30 days after receipt of the request. Following these instructions will greatly increase our ability to meet this goal. I also realize after going through these slides that I do need to point out something very important. These changes, this workbook and requirements, these are all only for the victim services portion of the DCFS Grants Management Unit. These items do not apply to any child welfare awards. So I apologize for not making that clarification earlier. Are there any questions? This was a lot of information. Are there any questions? Now we're going to do a walkthrough of the workbook. Bear with me. I'm going to be sharing my screen.
Let me unshare. I also wanted to state that at the end of the slide deck that was shared with you, there's also information about the Victim Services GMU staff assignments and which agencies each of them is going to oversee, and contact information for us. And then I also wanted to just make notes that our staff will be sending out new calendar invites for technical assistance soon, so be on the lookout for those. So Tracy, let me unshare my screen and then you can share yours.
Thank you. Can everyone see my screen? It has an instruction tab.
Yes, we can
Okay,
see it.
perfect. Thank you. Okay. Like the previous workbook, the new workbook has tabs at the bottom. The first is the instructions tab. Please review this prior to completing your first RFR. Many of your questions can be answered by reading this page. In addition, more detailed information is available in the Grant Instructions and Requirements, or GIRS. If you have questions after consulting this tab and the GIRS, please contact your assigned GPA. We're here to help you succeed. The next tab is a sample summary tab. This is new to this workbook, and I will come back to this in a moment. The remaining tabs include an RFR tab, the 3-letter month abbreviation here, and a summary tab for each month. The RFR tab, scroll up a little bit. The RFR tab is very similar to that of the previous workbook. It will be pre-populated with all the information from your executed NOSA. The agency reference number is the same as the award number. This coding area is for internal processing. The risk information has been added to this tab and will indicate the assigned risk level for your agency. The name, address, and vendor information will also be filled out, as will column A, the approved budget, all based on the executed NOSA. Column B will pull information from previous.
Tracy?
Yes.
Can you zoom in a little bit, please?
Lee. How's that? Is that a little bit better?
Yes, thank you.
No, thank you so much for letting me know that. What I see on my screen and what may be coming through could be completely different. As I was saying, column B, total prior requests, will pull information from previous RFR tabs to compile totals from prior RFRs. Column C pulls the amounts from the corresponding summary tab. Column D adds the current requested amounts to all previous requested amounts and provides a year-to-date spending snapshot, while column E subtracts the year-to-date spending totals and provides current budget balances. This tab will be locked. Once all expense information has been entered into the summary tab, which we'll move on to next, you will select either original or revised to indicate if this is the original or first RFR for this month, or whether it is a revision. After one of the boxes has been checked, make a PDF of the document and have an authorized signatory sign this bottom line here. This will become the RFR cover sheet for the RFR submission for that month. Are there any questions on the instruction tab and this RFR tab? Okay, we'll go on to the summary tab. This summary tab is completely new. Is this view okay, or would you like me to zoom in on this as well? Okay, I'll just continue with this view. There are 7 columns that run the length of the tab included in each category. This tab is not locked. This is very important to note. There is no pre-populated information. It will be the agency's responsibility to fill out all the information for each expense. So let's take a look at the columns on this tab. First, we have the employee vendor column. This is where you'll enter the name and title, if it's an employee, of the employee or vendor. The invoice and PO column. Here you will enter the invoice or purchase order number on the invoice or supply order if applicable, If there's no invoice or PO number associated with the particular expense, please enter NA. Payment type and document number. This is the type of payment that was issued, such as check, direct deposit, credit card, EFT, etc., and the designated number of the payment type or the last digits of the credit card if applicable. For example, it might be check number 58923 or credit card number 1458. Payment date. This is the date the payment was issued. Amount. This is the cost allocated grant percentage amount derived from the activity-based timesheets for personnel or other allocation methodology for the other categories. This is where the expense allocation worksheet comes into play. You will enter only the portion of the amount being expensed to the grant, not the total expense amount. This amount must match that on the allocation worksheet. Payroll service order dates. This is the date range of the payroll or services being expensed, or the order date for any supply orders. Expense description. This should be a brief but clear description or explanation of the expense. This should help clarify the type and purpose of the expense and how it relates to the grant. The categories. Each category has important reminders regarding types of documentation that need to either be submitted or maintained, depending on your risk level, as well as some important guidelines that affect each category. And those notes can be found just below the category headings. The categories each have space to enter expense details. If you need additional lines, please insert additional lines as needed. When inserting extra lines, just make sure that the sum in the total cell is pulling the amounts for all lines within that category. In general, when entering expense information, please use one line for each expense and enter information into each column. If a column is not applicable, please enter NA. For the most part, this should only affect the invoice PO number. All other cells should be completed. For indirect, you will enter your approved indirect rate into the amount cell. The worksheet will automatically apply that percentage to all category totals. However, if your agency only applies indirect to specific expenses, you may adjust the formula accordingly. This adjusted indirect application should already be noted in your NOSA. If not, please contact your GPA. Match entries will be similar to all other categories, though there may be more cause for not applicable entries based on the fact that expenses in this area can involve volunteers and donations. Are there any questions so far on the new summary tab?
Tracy, there is a question asking, how do you calculate the percentages of the hours of personnel?
So that will be that grant allocation percentage that we went over previously, where you divide the number of total hours worked on the grant by the total hours worked during the pay period. And then you apply that to gross wages, payroll taxes, fringe benefits, etc. Oh, I'm sorry, was that not, did that not answer the question? Let's get the, I'm going to move now to the sample summary and see if maybe this will answer some questions. So we created this sample summary tab to provide examples of what entries might look like. And we'll come back to personnel in just a moment, because that's kind of the hardest. So looking at travel, you'll enter the employee name or vendor in this first column. Here are some selections. I've got Charlie Brown, Best Western, Las Vegas, things of that sort. Followed by any invoice information if applicable. And if there aren't any invoices, just enter NA. Then payment information, followed by payment date. And then the amount. Now remember, this is the portion of the total expense amount that is being allocated to the grant. And then the dates of travel and a brief description of what each expense is. So we have things like mileage, virtual trainings, airfare, conference fees, etc. Operating is similar to travel. The vendor's name goes in the first column, followed by payment information, payment date, and allocated amount. Then this is where you'll enter either the service dates if the expense is a service, such as a utility, or the order date if it is a supply order. Then a brief description of the expense. Now, just a note, remember that service dates for first and last RFRs of an award period may need to be prorated. For these, only include the prorated dates that are being requested for reimbursements, as well as only the prorated amount. Order dates must fall within the award period, regardless of payment date. And then for supply orders, when you enter the description, please list those items that are being purchased that are being expensed towards the award. So I know that sometimes very large purchase orders are made. If you can just list those items that are being put towards the award so that we can tell very quickly and verify that everything that is being purchased on that supply order is allowable. The rest of the categories are very similar. I'll kind of scroll down and let you see kind of these examples that we have. Now this sample summary tab is included in every workbook so that you will have it there just as a reference. I have an example. Go down to other. And this is what your indirect will look like when the calculation's been put in. And then match. And like I said, match may have more cause to have more not applicable entries just because there's typically no payments involved. Okay, let's move back to personnel. The personnel is a little different in that there is a lot of information to provide in one section, and there is some flexibility in how you present it. For payroll, that includes employee wages. Please use one line for each employee documenting the payment information and pay period dates and describing what portion of personnel expenses are being documented, such as payroll, gross wages, or wages and payroll taxes. You want to include things such as payroll taxes, workman's comp, unemployment insurance, etc. in the same line as gross wages, that's fine. If you would prefer to break them out either by employee or by total allocated amount for all employees combined, either is fine. Similarly, you may list insurance information either as an allocated whole, like it is here, or broken out by employee. The important thing to remember is that your backup documentation must support what is being entered into the workbook and how it is being entered. And then similar to operating, remember that payroll and service dates for the first and last RFRs of award periods may need to be prorated. For these, only include the prorated dates and amounts that are being requested for reimbursement. So this concludes our walkthrough of the new workbook. Let's address some of your questions.
So Tracy, there is quite a few questions about the personnel section.
Okay.
And how they're going to cost allocate that. Did they use that cost allocation worksheet for that, or what do you suggest there?
That is really up to you. You're welcome to use that worksheet. If you have, I know several agencies use kind of an Excel spreadsheet breakdown to do that, which is fine. It's really what works best for your agency. If you don't already have a process in place to kind of break that out on your own, we'd be happy to work with you to find the best solution for your particular agency.
And then we also have a question about, so they use one per employee with the total pay for the month versus
Actually, so this again kind of allows some flexibility if you prefer to have a single line for all pay periods included in a month, that's fine. If you prefer to have your pay periods broken out into the individual pay periods, so each line for pay period per employee, that's fine as well. We're allowing a lot of flexibility in this. We just ask that the information is clearly evident in the backup documentation.
And then some people are asking if they can get a copy of the recording. We'll have that on our website though, won't we?
Yes. I know this is very, very different from what we've done in the past. And so please feel free to reach out to your assigned GPA. We'll be happy to walk you through your first RFRs, answer any questions as you go through your first couple to make sure, find the best solutions for you to make this as easy as possible. Our hope is that this will be an easier process for everyone than our previous RFR workbook. Were there any other questions, concerns?
There's one more question about, do they need to submit, for the low and moderate agencies, do they submit the payroll backup for their match?
That's a very good question. If it is not included, if the information is not included in the general ledger, then yes, at this time, I would continue to submit the payroll information for match. That's an excellent question. Thank you.
And then someone's asking if the fringe use
So yes, if you want to break the fringe out by employee, yes, you can have fringe broken out on a line specifically for an employee. Or if you so choose to have all particular fringe for all employees being allocated to a particular award, you can do it grouped kind of like I have it here. It's really up to you. So for example, if you would like to have, let's take Charlie here. And if you would like his health insurance or such, you would just do his portion, let's say, the employer paid portion, and just enter it like so. Then we would probably want here who the vendor is, since it was not included, just to make it nice and clear. Something like that. Is that kind of what you're asking? Okay, perfect. And Christine's reading a question, so I'm just waiting.
Okay, here it is. So this agency pays their staff we will have to prorate their checks, or for example, before.
Okay, so the question involved when a pay period crosses over from one award period to the next. So yes, so that if any hours, let's say it's a June, July, the award ended in June, and the new award starts in July. So those June hours would need to be placed on the June RFR, and then the July hours would need to be put onto the new award July RFR. So they would need to be prorated so that the service dates included would just be those for the award. So for example, if your if the pay period went from 6/20 to 7/5, I'm just throwing something out. You would not enter 6/20 to 7/5 on here. You would only enter 6/20 to 30. And then the amount would only be that prorated amount for this time period. Does that answer the question? Okay, perfect. Are there any other questions? I think Christine is answering some questions in chat. I know this is, we're providing kind of a lot of freedom on this personnel fringe area. So I think that might create some confusion because the previous workbook was so rigid. But we're happy to work with each agency individually to come up with the best and easiest solution. And I think that after the first month of maybe some growing pains, I think you'll find that this is actually quite a bit simpler. Okay, if there are no more questions, then this will conclude our the walkthrough of the new workbook. Was there anything anyone else would like to go over before we finish this presentation? Carla, did you have anything else?
It looks like there's one more question in the chat. It's if payroll includes a couple days from the prior month, but still within the award period, can it be billed that month?
Yes, we will be a little more flexible on payment dates. So if it's for example, like this sample is a March 23 example. If there's an expense that is on either side of March, so maybe it was paid in, for example, your March health insurance maybe was paid in February, the end of February, but you want to put it on your March RFR, that's fine. If there's something that you would prefer to have on your March RFR that maybe was paid on April 1st, that's fine. We'll be a little more lenient on payment dates that occur during months on either side of the RFR submission. If the payment date occurred, at a completely different month, for example, it's a June RFR, but the payment was back in December, we would ask for some notes explaining what happened. Why is this suddenly being added so late in the award period?
Okay, so this will conclude our presentation this afternoon. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. I shared the link to our website in the chat, and we will also let you know when the training has been uploaded to the website, so you can go back and review anything that you have questions on, or always, we're available to answer any questions. Just feel free to contact us whenever you need to. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a good rest of your day.
I have a quick question if you're still there.
Go ahead.
Yes.